why do hormones suddenly become important at 45 when they never were before? So women at 45 must replace them, but women at 25 can flatline them with hormonal birth control and go for decades like that. And that's somehow okay?
Dr. Lara Briden, welcome to the XX Lab. It was long thought that the only reason that humans experienced menopause was that, this must be evolutionary time lag. Recently, it has become very evident that menopause is in fact being actively selected for. Welcome to the XX Lab, where we explore the science and stories that matter to you. Today on the XX Lab, I'm sitting down with Dr. Lara Briden. Dr. Briden is a naturopathic doctor, period revolutionary, and the author of 3 books, including the Period Repair Manual, the Hormone Repair Manual, and Metabolism Repair for Women. She's a leading authority on all things hormones, cycles, and women's reproductive health. In today's conversation, we're going to be talking about the importance of women's sex hormones. We're going to talk about why we're framing menopause all wrong and how we can support women with PCOS and endometriosis using tools other than the birth control pill. You're going to walk away from this conversation with a deeper understanding of your sex hormones. And you can also walk away with understanding how you can support yourself and your cycle across the lifespan. Before we get started, please note that my opinions do not necessarily reflect those of TCU, the College of Science and Engineering, or the Department of Psychology. Instead, this is part of my mission to give women everywhere access to science and stories to help them live well. This is the XX Lab. I'm Dr. Sarah Hill. Let's get started. Dr. Lara Briden, welcome to the XX Lab.
Thanks so much, Sarah. It's great to see you again.
It's so great. It's so great to see you too. It's we have so many things in common that it was amazing in some ways that we ended up kind of studying some of the same things because our paths are so similar to one another.
Right. Yes, exactly. So, I mean, we're coming at it from slightly different angles, but we both have a passion for evolutionary biology, which I think we'll explore today. And
yes.
We've met in person. When that's the case, I always like to state it because in this online world, that's quite an unusual thing. So, yes.
It is an unusual thing. Yeah, we've met in person and with our shared fondness for Dr. Geraldine Pryor.
Yeah.
And so having the opportunity to spend time with you and with her, got me out of Texas and on an airplane to go to Vancouver to meet up with you all. Yeah. And it was absolutely invaluable to me that I learned so much from both of you. So anyway, yes, we have had the wonderful opportunity of getting to know each other in person and take a really lovely walk because I know that we're both big fans of taking a walk.
That's something else we have in common.
Yes. Yeah. So I want to start by actually talking about your background because one of the things that I love for listeners, you're going to get to learn everything about Dr. Briden. Do you want me to call you by your first name or do you want me to call you Dr.
Please,
Briden?
just call me Lara. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you're going to learn all these wonderful things that Lara knows. But we both ended up in the world of women's hormones and women's reproductive health. Me studying it from the sort of psychological point of view and Lara being a doctor. But we both started out in evolutionary biology. And so I really would love to know a little bit about what took you from studying evolutionary biology and then sending you on the path of becoming a naturopathic doctor.
Yeah, let's chat about that a little bit. It's always fun. I'm sure your guests are going to love getting a chance just to talk about themselves a little bit personally. But I'll lead with a quote, which I don't know who to attribute it to, but it's quite a famous quote. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And I would say the same for health. Nothing in health, to me, makes sense except in the light of evolution and through the lens of evolution. And I think it's one of these things where you can't unsee it. Like once you've been given that lens, it's like it's there forever. I mean, that's been my experience. So that quote is actually Theodosius Dobzhansky. And so on my syllabus, I teach a class in evolutionary psychology. And on the top of my syllabus, it says that. And then underneath it, it says,
nothing in psychology makes any sense either. Your professor.
I love it. Oh my gosh, we have the same quote. Or maybe I got that quote from your latest book. I can't remember where it came into my radar, but yeah.
It's so true. I mean, it's like once you start understanding that the reason that we have the traits that we have is because we inherited them from a successful ancestor who is either, able to reproduce and, survive long enough to be able to do that. You can't unsee it. No. I have the same experience that you do. It's like once I learned about the process of evolution by selection, it was everywhere. I saw it in everything. And especially like the design of the body, which is such a big mess of spaghetti that really doesn't make sense if you try to understand it as an engineer. But if you understand it as this, we're this really complex, interconnected organism that ultimately has its current form because the traits that we have must have helped our ancestors, find a mate and successfully reproduce. It all makes sense.
Oh, and I have to just on that topic, and I will get back to how, my background, but in your period brain book, I did like how you sort of framed it into the modes of the menstrual cycle. Each have a different purpose, which is totally makes sense. And more broadly, female physiology has lots of different modes, which is men are quirky in that I like to frame, this is my framing too, from an evolutionary biology perspective. Female is the standard, a default version. Male is the quirky variant. But so female physiology, human physiology has these different modes, within the menstrual cycle, but also, then pregnancy and postpartum, and even I would argue menopause, postmenopause is a different mode that is still being selected for because, we're done reproducing by that point, but our genes are still in play. And so what happens after menopause, can still be quite important. So
it is still important. Yeah. It's funny because, and this is one of the things that we'll talk about, because I know that you and I have a similar perspective on menopause and the way that it's being treated currently. Yeah. But, so it was long thought, for those of you who don't have any familiarity with evolutionary biology, it was long thought that the only reason that humans experienced menopause and that women stopped reproducing was that, this must be evolutionary time lag. Look at that. We're living longer than we used to live. And therefore, the fact that we are no longer able to reproduce at a certain age is just a byproduct of the fact that, that we're living longer and selection didn't act on our reproductive capacity past a certain age. And more recently, it has become very evident from looking at different genetic, you can do these, for those of you guys who really want to nerd out, you can do these like Hardy Weinberg equilibrium models that help look at whether or not traits are being actively selected in a population or whether it's like a byproduct of something else. And it appears that menopause is in fact being actively selected for, right? And so it is really interesting that, I think that it's sort of put aside as this, sort of leftover phase of life, but it actually serves a really important function. And maybe we just start right there. Tell us, I know that you know about this. So what is that, if we talk about women's life as being these different modes, what is that mode? I
know. Well, let's explore it a little bit, because I'm pretty passionate about, it's the intersection of female physiology, evolution, aging, pushback on the narrative, the quite destructive narrative that you've just described, which is that menopause is an accident of living too long, that we're just now we're leftovers, like we're just like nothing. And that's just not, if that were true, then I guess we would just accept it and, deal with that. But that is through the scientific lens, that does not appear to be the case. As you just said, it is evidence. And I love how evolutionary biologists crunch the numbers. It's like a math thing, right? Like they put the numbers in and see what works, like what will, in sort of game theory, like what will play out, when will menopause evolve, under what conditions. And in that scenario, like in different scenarios, the idea would be, the way I've heard it framed is a longer human lifespan for both sexes, arguably, was selected for because women in their post-reproductive years are so beneficial to the family group. So selecting for those longevity genes, arguably primarily because of women, was, what happened. And so men got I'm sure it was both, but through that lens, men got the benefit of living longer because women in their 50s, 60s, and 70s are just so important for the group. We know in the Hadza and other modern day forager people, women in their 50s, 60s, and into their 70s gather more food than any other demographic, which I just love. Like men are off telling stories by the fire. Women are like, okay, we've just got to feed the group here. And of course they gather more food. They share a lot of it because our own physiology has, in a way, I mean, we've shifted gears again into kind of a leaner physiology, which in our modern world with evolutionary mismatch can be negative because it can sort of push us more into insulin resistance, but we can circle back to that. But like in our ancestral state, how amazing that we didn't require as many starchy tuber, vegetables. We could share all of that with the young women and the babies, and we could like just quietly get things done. So, I say we, it's collectively and I very much embrace this, even though one thing I can share about myself is I didn't have biological children. I have a stepdaughter. So when I speak about, biology and lineages and evolution, it's not through a personal, I don't see it that way. It's a much more, it's almost like a spiritual, it's a collective, like we come from this long lineage of women, and I'm part of that, regardless of whether my own personal genes make it into the next generations, right? It's bigger than that. Yeah.
It is. It is bigger than that. And it's, the way I always think about it is like I've inherited the wisdom of, a continuous line of successful ancestors. Like I have the wisdom of 1,000,000 women or, 1,000 women or however many women that is baked into my psychology and how wonderful that is. And sometimes that psychology leads you on a path where you decide to have children. Sometimes it leads you on a path where you decide not to have children. And all of those things are equally valid and equally explainable by our biology. And it's it's an amazing and really wonderful thing. And it does help to provide explanations for things like menopause and like you were saying, the grandmother hypothesis, which is that sort of leading hypothesis out there right now about the evolution of menopause. And it's essentially that at a certain point, women become more valuable in terms of the survivability of their relatives by not reproducing and not, creating opportunities for gene transmission directly, but instead with aiding the group, right? So aiding their female relatives, and especially, if they have children and grandchildren and so forth. Oh, go ahead.
Well, no, they're male relatives as well. So one of the studies, and I think that it's all still in motion, like it's all still in play. The scientists are crunching the numbers and which is great, which is fun. Like, so more insights might come. But one study I saw, which really piqued my interest, was that menopause evolved. Menopause will evolve. Menopause evolves when adult sons stay with their mothers. So at that point, so that's true in orcas and like a couple of the only other sort of mammals that have this extended post-reproductive period. So basically what they crunch the numbers, it's like at some point, if you're still influential over your adult son, you become vicariously male. I don't know if people are kind of following that logic, but like one of the things orcas do for their adult sons is they stop them from fighting. Well, they guide them to food. They increase the survival. And so then you become vicariously male because your adult sons can actually make pass on a lot more genes than your adult daughters. It's probably both. Probably you're helping your daughters and your granddaughters, but also your sons. So I just think it is really, it's almost like the way I think about it sometimes is like, it's almost like in ant colonies, you have the reproductive queen. And so she's having sex and making babies. And then you've got a lot of these drones, right? They're non-reproductive. And because they share genes with the queen, they're doing all of this work and tending to the colony and doing all of this stuff and supporting the queen being able to reproduce. And this is their best strategy for getting genes into the next generation is not to reproduce at all, but instead to do this auxiliary work that's just as important. And what's cool about human females, and some of these other species is like, we get to do both. Yeah. We get to be the primary reproductive. And then at a certain point where the risks of pregnancy sort of outweigh the benefits of pregnancy. And then we can aid in our the survivability of our group and our sons and our daughters and their sons and daughters and so on and so forth. It's so fascinating. It is. It is. I know the reason I mentioned before about me not personally having biological children, because I've seen a bit of pushback on social media against the grandmother hypothesis, saying, well, but what if you're not a grandmother? I'm like, it doesn't matter if you're a grandmother.
Matter.
It doesn't matter or not.
No, I mean,
the meaning is still there. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, it's like a menstrual cycle, right? It's like, well, what if I don't want to have children? Well, that's great. Like, and you have that choice. And isn't it wonderful to live in a time where you can make that decision? Because it used to be that if you were a woman who liked to have sex with men, you were going to be a mother, whether you wanted to or not. Yeah. And that's not the case anymore. And isn't that wonderful? But that still, your menstrual cycle is still going to be acting as if you are going to be having a baby. Ooh. And every month that's going to happen.
100%. We'll circle back to the menstrual cycle, because obviously we both have a lot to say about that. But one thing I would say, one of my key takeaways, which good to get it in the first, 10 minutes of the podcast, is that regular ovulatory cycles, regular ovulation is how women make hormones. So it's, again, this is an example of the default human physiology is cyclic, at least for, three or four decades. And then, men are weird. Like, men make their hormones every day. It's like, what a strange, quirky thing to do. Although, men, we might have talked about this in one of our previous interviews, but the thing I love about male hormones, is how much maybe this is in your book too, how much they're influenced by social things, like more than women are. Like, so their testosterone, I love this particular stat, and I'd be curious to know if it's been replicated but there was a study where like testosterone plummets after a man's sports team loses, and not the team they're playing on, but just the team they're a fan of, and it stays low for a couple of days. And I just find that really kind of endearing.
It's charming. Yeah.
Poor men. Yeah, their hormones are all over the place.
Yeah, no, it's so funny because, and I talked about that, and I think I talked about it in both books, honestly, that women get we always get a hard time about being hormonal and are being unpredictable and fickle and, this and that and the other. And the fact of the matter is, like, our primary sex hormones are not responsive to the environment in the way that men's sex hormones are. And so for men, they have this incredibly dynamic hormone system with testosterone. And you get these wild swings where if a man's favorite sports team wins, like, they get a big surge in testosterone. If their favorite sports team loses, they get a big decrease in testosterone. And one of my favorite studies was showing that if you put a man in a room next to firearms, so you just set him and there's a gun on the table, he'll get a big rise in testosterone just simply from being in the presence of a gun. And and it's like funny, we can laugh about it, and it's like, thank goodness, thank goodness that we have these sex differences and that our hormones are responding to the types of things that they're supposed to be responding to. To get us to guide our behavior in ways that are functional in terms of promoting our survival and promoting our reproduction. And, I, as somebody who is, married to a man, I like the idea that if my partner saw something potentially dangerous, that his testosterone would increase. So that way he would potentially, that would put him in a better position to be able to fight and protect me and the rest of our family.
Agree. I'm actually also quite a big fan of. I'm also married to a man. I mean, but I know not all our listeners are, so that's fine. We'll just. Yes. One other interesting thing about men, just on the topic of testosterone, and I think their hormonal profile. I'm curious. We're just sharing trivia about hormones, but I forget what they call the list, but there's the list of people who, like heroes, basically selfless, who put their own lives at risk for others, and then you make this list and. It's like 95% men. So women only occasionally will do that, which actually makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. I mean, maybe different ways to analyze that, but men are more likely to put their life on the line, basically, which I think more broadly, even if you don't have a man personally in your life, or like that's something in society that is pretty interesting, I think, and has been part of our evolution as a species. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, 100%. Because females, historically, because they're mothers and they're the greater investing sex. So in addition to being the ones who have to go through pregnancy, then there's all that time spent lactating, and females, for those reasons, because we play such a greater role historically in the reproductive act, that makes us more valuable. Yeah. Just in terms of like, what would the cost be to offspring if this person is lost? And especially for young children, the loss is greater for mother than it would be for father. And ultimately that leads us to be more conservative. And also it, sort of there's benefits to men in addition to them, like, sort of being quote unquote less valuable. There's also potential huge reproductive benefits that can come from a man who does some sort of a big act of valor. Yeah, some heroic act that could potentially lead to mating opportunities that he wouldn't be able to get outside of that.
Many mating opportunities, potentially. Yes.
Yes, that could then reward that type of heroic act in a way that would lead to the inheritance of a brain that when it's doing that internal Darwinian calculus about do I do this thing or do I not do this thing, the potential reproductive rewards are ultimately baked into the system, making the man's foot more likely to press on the gas pedal than a woman's.
They're more risk-taking. They're arguably more expendable, I guess, which is kind of throughout society, which has been women are more valuable. Anyways, it is interesting once you start zooming out and acknowledge, some of the things that come from our evolutionary history end up being a little bit sort of uncomfortable socially, and we don't have to go into all that, but that's just, I mean, I think that's just sort of about being reality based, and we try to be as, interpret things as realistically as possible and not, I mean, there is, I guess I will, in case any listeners are sort of having these thoughts, like, one danger with seeing things through the lens of evolutionary biology is you can sort of create narratives around things that aren't true. So this is where science comes in, trying to sort of check these things and replicate them and,
right. Yeah. And test the hypotheses, right? Because they're not always right.
No,
they're not always right.
Some stories that have been come up with through the evolutionary lens are not correct. So,
right.
Yeah. No,
so what led you
to
go from that world into going into naturopathic medicine?
Yeah, good. So broadly, I'm Canadian, even though I live in New Zealand and I lived in Australia for a long time. And I'm going way back just briefly, like I'm not going to give my whole life story, but, I grew up in the wilds of Canada, like really in a very wilderness area. And so I loved, I grew up around, I think maybe this had an influence. Like I went to this my school was like fewer than 200 people from kindergarten to grade 12. And half of them were ranchers, like farmers. So I grew up in this very like surrounded by nature kind of area. So that probably had an influence. I was very interested I was an avid reader. So when I got to university, I was just keen on biology and English and literature. I do think that I'm curious if because you're such a good writer too and like writing, I'm curious if you have that background in sort of reading fiction or writing as well. Is that there for you?
For me, I actually thought I was going to go into creative writing.
Okay.
And then I found science. It was the weirdest thing, but I found out that it works really well because the thing that made me, people think that I would be a good creative writer is that I'm creative and I come up with ideas, but that's actually like the best thing you can do with that type of brain is put it in science. Because it's like, that's all that science is like looking at things and saying, I don't think so. And then coming up with a new idea.
Right. Being able to come up with a new possible story for what's going on.
Right. Like what's going on and then test it. Right. And then see whether or not you're right. So that's really interesting that you also sort of were going down the path of considering writing.
I was like writer, biologist. And then I definitely went more into biology, I did love science. So I was working as a biologist. I published a peer-reviewed, so out of my honors thesis, still undergraduate, but I did do quite a lot of field work. I probably talked to you about this before. I was looking at sex differences in the foraging behavior of bats specifically. So it was the thing about biology that kind of, I'll be honest, that pushed me out of it eventually. Especially field biology, it is so much work. I don't know if people realize how much work scientists do. Like it is just, and at the end of the day, I wanted to be a biologist. I did love that. And I did also realize that once you get to the higher level and PhD and you can just let all the work, you can have your grad students do a lot of the work. But I just thought I just don't know if I can put in the hours that are required to be a scientist.
Oh, I was going to say, in some of the places that you have to go, so one of my very first research papers, this will be funny for people who follow my work, was because it's so far outside of field, but it was looking at the mate choice copying behaviors of the sailfin molly, which is a fish. It's a species of fish that lives in the San Marcos River, which is this gunk-filled, stinky brown river in San Marcos, Texas. And so I had to go down there because we need to catch wild type fish because we want to see how this plays out like in the wild. And so you have to go and capture these things. And I remember, and I went out there and you know, I'm in the psychology department and I was collaborating with a biologist. So I show up in my pink flip flops and shorts. And I remember, and the biologists who I was going with are there in waders. Yeah. And because they told me to wear water shoes. And so I thought like these pink, you know, flip flops were going to be, no. So one of the postdocs who was there looked at me and he's like, Miss Hill, this is not a day at the beach.
No.
And I had to go in there. I had to go and catch. My feet immediately got sucked under into this muck. I mean, that is hard work. And a lot of times it puts you in really kind of not so desirable places.
Okay. Well, we're exactly on the same page. So my early field work and that and I did a lot of different types of biology research, but they were studying bats. So we were catching bats, which involves at night, like we were sleeping in the tent in the mountains of Canada, sleeping in a tent during the day, which is hard to do, out crashing through the forest at night when there's bears, and also like wading through a marsh. I mean, we were wading too, and there's mosquitoes, and it's not as romantic as people might think, like doing biology research. But also through all of that, I do still feel like biologists are my tribe. Even now, like 40 years later, when I'm occasionally around a biologist, I'm like, oh, they're my people. Like they really, because I think they do have this like been through the wars, like kind of like toughness that, So to any biologist listening, yes, I love you. I get the thank you for all your hard work. So I recently had a chance to go back. So I did one peer-reviewed paper. I wrote some other just sort of like graduate kind of honors thesis level papers. And I recently had a chance to go back and read some of them, or I went back and read some of them. And I thought, oh my God, I was thinking, how stupid was I? I'm just scared to read what I wrote at 22. Like, what on earth was I writing? And it was actually surprisingly good. You should go back sometimes and read. I mean, it's not, I was at a little like scientist in training. So I was using all the right words. I was also like now 35 years later, I can look back and think, oh, I was so interested in female physiology, and that framing female physiology as normal. That was my calling from, you know, in the 90s, basically. I was that keen on taking that lens. So that's only now have I been able to understand how much that influenced my later work. But what made me transition from, I did seriously, like at the end of my honors thesis, think about, okay, which graduate program in evolutionary biology am I going to, and I had it, the paths were open to me. I was in that route, but my main, it's, you know, it's not very flattering to me, but my main reason for turning away was just the amount of work that was going to be required to go down that path. And also the way scientists, especially at least at that time in that field, had to just put your kind of life on like you had to go which university would take you. Is this, I mean, you know, you couldn't just say, oh, I want to live in this place and I'm going to do my job here. You had to, it felt like a lot, and I wasn't prepared to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a lot. Like, I mean, so many people I know, they have to take a job and they live in the middle of a cornfield in North Dakota. Yeah. And that's just what you get. You know, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit is how it works in academia.
Yeah. So academia. And so and also,
I was going to say,
yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was going to ask, so did that, like, but why naturopathic medicine?
Well, I think I also, part of it, I wanted to work more with people. I do like people, even though I'm a strong introvert. I mean, that's another part of it. I'm not super good gregarious, but I'm very interested in people's stories. That comes from the love of literature, I think. That's maybe where that's coming in. But even now, I still do, I mean, writing is my main occupation now, but I still do a few days a month with patients. I just did one yesterday, actually, where I just genuinely love hearing people's stories. Like, it's just like sitting down and like, it's maybe a little bit voyeuristic, but like, okay, tell me tell me what's going on. And also, you know, being able to help people, that's part of it. But I think the first layer is actually just curiosity about people. And so, so that's been there throughout. I think actually curiosity is a common theme. I think that has to be there for scientists, biologists. I think it has to be there for good clinicians. Well, hopefully I'm a good clinician, but it has to be there for clinicians as well. Like, it's this constant like, oh, what does that mean? I mean, maybe it's an open-mindedness, I guess, or curiosity.
Is that the same curiosity that led you to really dive into the menstrual cycle and how, what the purpose of the cycle is? And, a lot of people know you from your work, your first book, The Period Repair Manual, and then there's a Hormone Repair Manual, and then we moved on to metabolism.
Yeah.
And so, and you have a big public presence just in terms of helping to educate the masses. Which is wonderful because about their cycles and about how the female body produces hormones and what it all means. And it's information that I didn't learn any of that until I was in a PhD program. And what I love about what you've done is you've taken that information that normally a person would have to get a PhD to understand how their body works, which is insane. And instead, you're taking this information and you're making it something that's available to everyone. And so what got you so interested in specifically the issues of the menstrual cycle and women's hormones?
Yeah, great question. Well, again, different layers, but the first step was that's who was coming to me in my practice. So once I qualified as a naturopathic doctor, I just hung my shingle. My first 5 years of work were back in the wilderness area where I grew up. So small town, most of my patients were ranchers and teachers and just quite, in many ways, quite practical people. Just thinking back, I mean, I'll get to the women's health aspect of it soon, but to those early patients, it always made sense to them that their diet would affect their health. Because that was true with their animals. So that was not a radical idea for a lot of them. So that was very grounding as well. But back from almost from day one, I was treating some men, but mostly it was women. And as you can imagine in the 90s, these are I mean, it hasn't improved that much today, but the high dose birth control pills, the old school Premarin, old type of HRT, which was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. I'll tell you that. Lots of hysterectomies. It was just on the ground. Okay, I've got to come up with something different for these patients. And thankfully, the tools I'd been given did, women's bodies respond incredibly well, which is not that surprising, but would respond to some of these things. And so it was kind of my early work in the menstrual cycle was just a survival as a clinician. I had to come up with solutions. And my patients helped me learn what worked and what didn't work. So that there's nothing more valuable than that, actually. The 8 years of training, university training, are nothing compared to what comes later when you're actually trying to help people. So there was that. And then there was also, I think, another part of my personality, which I guess I know is partly what you're doing in this podcast, is exploring what makes people tick. I'm sure I share this with a lot of people, but I really don't like when the narrative is wrong. When there's a glaringly wrong narrative. I wouldn't say I'm not an activist in any sense, really, but the narrative, what became pretty obvious to me early on, this narrative, which is very strong. I mean, I call it the era or the epoch of contraceptive drugs. So there was it was very strong in the 90s. It's lessened a bit now, but this idea that it's fine. The solution to any women's health thing is to shut it all down with hormonal birth control. It's like if there's a problem, just shut it all down. And back in the 90s, I was like, that doesn't seem right. Why should women have to shut down their hormones? We need from my biology lens, I'm like, well, we need hormones, for health. And this, prevailing narrative that it was a lot of wishful thinking, I think, went into that narrative. It's we can, I'll just sketch out what I would see has been the narrative of contraceptive medication for the last 60, 70 years. Of course, we got right to the meat of it, because this is the area where my work has been controversial, but although it's far less controversial now than it was 20 years ago when I started writing about this. But the narrative is, okay, we've got these hormone-like medications. They switch off the communication between the brain and the ovaries. They switch off ovarian hormone production to menopausal levels in many cases, depending on the type of birth control. They flatline hormones. And in place of hormones, we're going to have these medications that are, kind of estradiol and progesterone, but not really. And we're just going to hope for the best. There's been a lot of wishful thinking. It's like, we're going to hope that's good enough for everything, for the brain, so it's this jarring, and I'll tell you the jarring, like now in 2026, the sort of jarring thing that I have similar sensation is, so in 2026, we have a great enthusiasm on the one hand for female hormones in the context of perimenopause, like, okay, we lose them, we must replace them. It's like, okay. And they have all these benefits. And we can explore that a bit more. I mean, I would agree with that to a large extent, but it's to me, very jarring that why do hormones suddenly become important at 45 when they never were before? So women at 45 must replace them, but women at 25 can flatline them with hormonal birth control and go for decades like that. And that's somehow okay. Like this is an example of like me not being able to stay silent when I'm like, I just don't think that makes any sense. Yeah.
It's so interesting because I've had that exact same thought. Because it's completely contradictory, right?
Yes.
Where it's like hormones are so important. We need to have hormones to support brain health,
yes.
Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, with cardiovascular health, the healthier bones, right? Geraldine talked to us about that, right? And then in the same breath, saying that oh no, you should start going on hormonal birth control as soon as you get your period. If your periods are irregular, and why do you have to bother with this? When it's like, no, that's actually how your body is producing hormones, and and when you're taking it, it can keep. I mean, it keeps your levels so low that you're not getting the benefits of your sex hormones during your reproductive years. Mm-hmm. And I will be absolutely astonished, if we learn that has no downstream clinical impact on like the brain or any other body part.
I know. It's been a weird time. I mean, this is all, and I'm also, okay, the other thing I'm interested in, just for another little bit about me, is one of my main pastimes is history podcasts. So I do like history as well. And so if you start looking at medical history and the different narratives that kind of take hold, and I would just say at any one time, we look back and we think, okay, 150 years ago, what they were doing, was very weird. But from their lens, like at that time, that was totally normal for them. Like that was like the established narrative. And I will acknowledge that, modern medicine is quite a bit more informed than it was 200 years ago. Fair enough. But still, just the nature of how it works, there are some narratives today that future generations of doctors and scientists are going to look back on and think, what the heck? Like, what were they doing? So, I think we've been in one, and I hope I live long enough to see just how the tail end of that, like sort of how future scientists might look back on all of this. I will find it very interesting. It's also quite humbling, I think, to see things through that broader lens. So we've talked about seeing things through the deep history lens of evolutionary biology, but I think there's also value in seeing things through the human history lens of just the hubris of previous generations and what they, what I mean? Like when they were so certain about things that later were like, So I think there's been a lot of certainty around contraceptive medication. There's a lot of it's been wishful thinking. And all that said, both of us agree. Like we have to give the obligatory little, like, of course, it's an effective way of avoiding pregnancy, and it can certainly relieve symptoms. So there's always nuance. Neither of us have ever stated that categorically it's all bad and no one should take it. Like, that's obviously not what we're saying. But there has been, from a scientific lens, lens, there's been sort of a bit of missed nuance around it.
Right. Well, and with some of that missed nuance, I think that there's also missed opportunities, because even if we accept the fact that, women do not have a lot of options for preventing pregnancy right now. We just don't. We don't have a lot of good ones. And so hormonal birth control right now is still going to be the best option for many women, I believe. And I think that if I was 25 again, I would be one of those women. Knowing everything that I know now, I would still be on it. But I would know the trade-offs I was making. And more importantly, I think that, one thing that's like really been lost, in this conversation that we've had culturally where, women's hormones don't matter and they're just this problem that needs to get managed, and let's just go ahead and shut them down and who cares. before we decided they were so important only for women in menopause, which makes no sense at all. Then asking the question, well, what if we treat women on hormonal birth control like menopausal women and give them hormone therapy? And so one thing that we're doing in my lab right now is trying to examine like whether you can reduce some of the negative symptoms of hormonal birth control by supplementing with micronized progesterone. Yeah. And because women who are taking hormonal birth control, because progestins are not the same as progesterone, you don't get some of these really lovely effects that progesterone has, especially it has these beautiful anti-inflammatory effects in the body. It's got anti-excitotoxic effects in the brain. And so what we're wondering is whether if you give women progesterone, which is then going to have these lovely downstream consequences that you don't get from progestins, and we supplement women who are on the pill with this, might this lead to a better experience, or putting them on testosterone? Because we also know that their testosterone levels tank. And so like, are there things that we can be doing to make the birth control experience better by acknowledging the fact that it's not perfect?
Yeah, I love that your lab's doing that. You mentioned that before. I think that's going to be fascinating.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. I'll keep you. Totally. I'll totally keep you posted on it, because I really do think that, we need to, if we accept the fact that hormones matter and that they're good for women, and that biologically our experience as a human is relied on having them, and then we shut down their hormone production, we need to do something. Yeah. To improve their experience. Yeah.
No, it's great. I think that's amazing. I can't wait to share that research when it's available. One other thing, just while I'm thinking of it, and just as a practical detail, I know people have probably heard me talk about this before, but the hormonal IUD does not suppress hormones to the extent that most other types do. So for many women, especially older women, when there's a more robust signaling between the brain and the ovaries, it is possible to ovulate and have actually real menstrual cycles through the hormonal IUD, which can be a bit weird because you might not bleed. So just as a little compare and contrast is on the estrogen methods of hormonal birth control that induce a bleed, those kinds of things. They shut down hormones, they switch off ovaries, but they medically induce a bleed. On those types, you can bleed but not cycle. And on the hormonal IUD, ironically, you can cycle, as in make your hormones in a cyclic pattern, but sometimes not bleed. So they're quite different, which is where there's nuance in the different types of hormonal birth control. And I do feel like, I don't know if you probably looked at the data, there is a move away from the estrogen sort of really like hormone flattening types more towards hormonal IUDs, which is that there in the data that younger women especially are choosing? Yep.
Yeah, it's being pushed a lot by doctors, and I've got my own theories on why that is, but that aren't necessarily not positive.
I want to hear that.
It's just, well, here's my all right,
tell me your
y'all,
theory.
Here's my tinfoil hat. So I'm gonna put my tinfoil hat on. And to say that the progestin as used in the hormonal IUD is still under patent. That's why I think that it's getting recommended.
It's under patent, or it's no longer.
No, it is still under patent. It's still under patent. And so they can still make money off of prescribing it. And so I think that when the patent expires on the hormonal IUD, I think that it might change people's tune about the extent to which they're pushing it. And again, this is just me being slightly paranoid. I'm sure there's other reasons. Most doctors. I think most doctors are absolutely wonderful human beings who are absolutely doing what is best for their patients. And some of the education that doctors get is from drug companies, and that's just the way that it is. And it's not because the doctors are doing anything wrong. So let me just say that. And but I do think that I think that at least in the US, the shift toward the hormonal IUD, I think a lot of it was being pushed very heavily by the drug companies to get people on that IUD, because it was a new way of using levonorgestrel, which then allowed it to go back into patent. So,
it was back, because I was saying it's an old progestin, but it's back under patent because of the delivery method.
The new, because whenever you have a new use of an old drug, you can get the patent extended. And so anyway, that's my own tinfoil hat thing. But I'll say this about the hormonal IUD. that I think is really interesting. And as you noted, you can cycle on it.
Yes. Yeah.
And produce your own hormones and all of that. But what's interesting about it and why I think it's so messy to talk about is because for some women, and it's actually many women, when they're on it for the first year or so, they don't ovulate at all.
Right.
And so they're producing no hormones, and they're not getting any hormones from the IUD because they're very, very low. And so, like, when women are first on it, it can be an absolutely jarring experience because here it is, you're not producing any hormones and you're not getting any hormones exogenously. Yeah. And that creates a weird place. And, when we look at the hormonal, like when you look at the research that looks at the differences in psychological side effects, I'm talking about mental health related side effects in particular, like depression and anxiety. Like what they tend to find is that the hormonal IUD with teenagers has these like outsized negative effects on mental health. And I think that it gets at kind of what you were saying, and that here's this group where the communication between their brain and their ovaries is underdeveloped. And so there's not a lot, the brain and the ovaries aren't very well practiced with each other yet. And then, when ovulation is being fully shut down, I think that it creates essentially like psychological or neurobiological cacophony.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I remember the hormonal IUD did, in terms of that old now, 2016 Danish study. That was a watershed moment in all of this conversation. That we put that in the show notes. They, for the first time, kind of unambiguously pointed, there was a signal, like a pretty strong signal. It wasn't a huge effect, but like a sort of undeniable effect of negative mood from hormonal birth control. And I remember the hormonal IUD was one of the worst. And so, I mean, I think progestin-only methods are always going to be worse because the synthetic estrogen, as much as it's not quite as good as estradiol, it still has mood stimulating beneficial effects. Would you agree? I mean, estrogen and almost any kind of estrogen is positive to mood when it's in the right, at the right level. Yeah.
And in fact, from what I understand, the only reason that they started including estradiol or estrogen, the ethinyl estradiol in hormonal birth control was because it made people feel better.
To offset that's my understanding of the history as well. They originally started with progestin only, didn't they? And then added estrogen to make so was less horrible.
Less horrible. And so, generally, and I always tell women this if they're just asking for my counsel after I remind them that I'm not a medical doctor and that they should never follow any advice that I give them. But that, that generally what the research finds is that women's experiences on the progestin only ones does tend to be a little bit more psychologically risky than the combination products, which that little boost of estrogen can lead to a more favorable psychological outcome from birth control.
Oh, so this is good. I'm so happy to talk to you again. Every time I talk to you, I learn things, and also that's kind of confirming. It's just good for me to sort of collaborate with you. That was my understanding too about the progestin only. The other just quick thing about progestin only methods with the levonorgestrel is it's androgenic, so women can get skin breakouts, even hirsutism, facial hair loss to some extent after a long time on progestin-only methods. And that had been obvious clinically. This is the classic story. So there's some things that have been obvious clinically for a long time, and the research takes a while to catch up. I mean, this is actually just the nature of medicine. So this is not unique to women's health, but there was a study that came out just, I think, in the last 12 months. If people are interested, I can put it in the show notes, but demonstrating or observing that, higher likelihood of androgen, breakouts, facial hair and hair loss on the progestin only methods, including the hormonal IUDs. And also I would put weight gain in that category potentially, depending on the type of progestin. Some progestins don't cause weight gain, but some can. Especially the second generation progestins from my read of the literature seem to be the ones that are most likely to have some of those androgenic side effects because they are the most androgenic, and so you get the weight gain, the acne, as you noted, the hair. So they're derived from testosterone, just to be clear to people. I mean, second generation are derived. They're not derived from progesterone. They're not. I love. We must put your Substack in the show notes. Or I mean, I'm going to share it again in my next newsletter. Your one about how progestins are not progesterone. They're not progesterone. They're not even cousins. They're not. They're only.
No, they're not.
they're only like the most vaguely related. Like a lot of them are quite different from progesterone. And in that sense, that's again where some of the confusion comes from. Because so the ethinyl estradiol, like the synthetic estrogen, is somewhat similar to estradiol. Like it's on the same page anyway. Like they're sisters,
right? Yeah, No, I would call those sisters.
Yeah.
Yes,
and it's stronger, and there's differences, but they're not as like jarringly different as progestins are from progesterone. And also the other thing about estrogen versus progesterone, for clarity, because words matter quite a lot. Estrogen is a generic term. So estrogen, the word estrogen can legitimately describe all kinds of things, including the synthetic estrogen in the pill. Progesterone is not a generic term. It's a biochemical term. And so because they get used like they're paired, we tend to think of progesterone as also being generic, but it's not. Just for
no, because it's a progestogen, right? That's the generic term, right? A progestogen. Yeah. And then progestin and progesterone are both progestogens.
Yeah.
I think did I scientifically classify those? I think that there is. I do think that it is progestogen. I'll verify that and drop that in the show notes as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, progestins most of them are synthesized from testosterone.
Yeah.
Generations 1 through 3. And then the 4th generations are synthesized from spironolactone, also not progesterone.
No.
And so in all cases, they just manipulate the molecules enough to stimulate progesterone receptors, which then quiets the communication between the brain and the ovaries. So it tells the brain not to stimulate the ovaries. And that's how you prevent ovulation.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have the beautiful downstream consequences that actual endogenous progesterone does, which has, those benefits in terms of it's anti-proliferative, which means it can have anti-cancer effects. It helps to lead to I don't remember if it's the growth or differentiation of osteoblasts in the bone. So it helps to contribute to bone strength. It is anti-excitotoxic, meaning it's calming to the brain. It also is anti-inflammatory. It has all these really beautiful effects, and you don't get any of those from progestin.
Let's give a tiny biochemical detail. I'm sure your listeners might already know this, but we'll just mention allopregnanolone because it's the neurosteroid. It's like a steroid version of a neurotransmitter, I guess. I mean, this is your area more, but this is where the wishful thinking comes in, because progesterone, it acts on progesterone receptors, but it also has this neurosteroid that acts on GABA receptors. So it's quite dynamic. And is it true to say that no progestin metabolizes to allopregnanolone?
Yes, that is true. None that's available. So I read, and this was probably, I don't know, 5 years ago.
Yeah.
I read a paper about a progesterone-derived progestin.
Okay.
That is only used in like a very small population. I believe in like Central America or South America. It's available there, but nobody else uses it. So I'll say that I'm not going to say that there's no such thing, because I can't say that anymore, because I did read about this.
Yeah.
But it's not available anywhere. Right. So any of the progestins that you can get that's in the birth control that you are on, listener, is not derived from progesterone, and therefore when it gets broken down in the body, you don't release this really beautiful neurosteroid called allopregnanolone. And that's kind of the moneymaker in a lot of these positive effects, is that it's activating, for example, GABA receptors in the brain. And what we find is that women who are using hormonal birth control, they have lower levels of this calming neurosteroid in their systems in the periphery. So when you're studying this in humans, you have to study it in the periphery, which just means outside of the brain.
Yeah.
Because there's obviously
look in the brain.
You can't. Like look inside the brain with humans is tricky. But they've done some rodent model studies where they look in the central nervous system, and they see less expression of allopregnanolone in the nervous systems of the mice that are treated with progestins.
It's the devil's in the details, right? Like this feels like a very important detail that, of course, 60 years ago when they started using progestins, nobody was thinking about allopregnanolone. I would venture to say nobody was contemplating allopregnanolone or anything to do with that. But this is one of those examples of like wishful thinking. I'm sure it'll be fine.
It'll be fine.
What could possibly go wrong?
Well, I think that, it's like, I think that, as people started to think, estrogen matters. And I think that that's part of the menopause conversation that we're having now.
Yeah.
And, it's essentially like where they like count receptors It's like, oh, wow, there's receptor sites for estrogen everywhere. Like,
Everywhere.
wow, like this is
In
important.
the brain. Yeah.
And in the brain, like this everywhere. And, and when it comes to like receptor to receptor, progesterone has fewer receptors in the brain, but it has almost as many receptors throughout the body as estrogen. And progesterone breaks down into allopregnanolone, which gets picked up by GABA receptors, which is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter system in the brain. Right. So this is the primary set of brakes that the brain uses to slow neurotransmission. And the fact that, women who are on hormonal birth control don't have, they're not getting sufficient allopregnanolone production, because the primary way by which female bodies produce allopregnanolone is through ovulation and the release of progesterone.
Yeah,
so that's kind of a big deal.
It is a big deal. There are, there's never absolutes, because there are, now I'm just getting a little biochemistry lesson from you, but there are other ways. The brain also makes its own allopregnanolone, right? And there's other, it can derive from other, not just from ovarian progesterone, but other.
Right. Yes. Like from adrenal. So we do produce some progesterone from our adrenal glands, especially in response to stress. And that too ultimately leads to the release of allopregnanolone, and you can get like de novo production of allopregnanolone in the brain. Yeah. What's really interesting about de novo production of anything in the brain is a lot of times it happens in response to what's happening in the periphery. So just to give you an example of this, like when you have heightened levels of inflammatory activity in the body, you also get de novo production of cytokines in the brain. Yep. And a lot of that is to deal with, and you can get some leakage through the blood-brain barrier, but essentially it is the brain trying to replicate what's happening in the periphery because of the blood-brain barrier and needing to essentially create this experience that's also going on in the rest of the body.
That is very
which is fascinating.
Yeah, no, I didn't know about that. That's very interesting. One thing about this just came into my mind. I just want to, because this is one of the little, I would say, myths that there's out there. Again, it's not absolutely a myth, but it essentially is this idea that progesterone converts to cortisol. I just want to clarify this. So, I mean, it can convert to cortisol in the adrenal glands. It's part of the steroid cascade, but for all intents and purposes, like for, ovarian progesterone or exogenous progesterone that you take, mostly goes to allopregnanolone. Would you agree?
Yes.
Is that true? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, yes. And I would say that this idea, and this idea lives out there as like the progesterone steal hypothesis, I think is what it's called.
Yeah.
And this has been more or less debunked in the world of science, where it's like, yes, it is true that when women are experiencing a lot of stress, that leads to lower levels of progesterone, but it's not because the progesterone is being gobbled up and turned into cortisol.
No.
Instead, what's happening is that you're not ovulating, and so the chain of the sort of causal chain is like cortisol stress, right? Chronic stress, failure to ovulate, lower levels of progesterone. Yep. And so the best thing that we can do to support progesterone, one of the best things that we can do is to support our nervous system and prevent chronic stress. But it's not because the stress is going to be stealing our progesterone. Yeah,
that's good. I just wanted to get that out there, because also then people are scared to take progesterone because they're like, oh, because it's all going to turn to cortisol. It's like, no, it's not. No. So
that's interesting. Yeah, because clinically, of course, I'm not a clinician, and so I don't deal with people like saying I don't want to take this because of this. So that's really interesting. Yeah. And so I want to step back for a minute, because we talked about birth control, and clearly, you think that that a healthier, happier way to be as a female is to be cycling, right? And to enjoy the production of your sex hormones. And just for those of you who aren't familiar with the menstrual cycle, like as you begin, your egg follicles are maturing, your body starts releasing estrogen, you ovulate, the empty egg follicle becomes a temporary endocrine structure that starts releasing progesterone. That rises, and if you're not pregnant, it falls, and then you bleed, and then it all starts over again, right? So you get this beautiful rise and fall of estrogen, a rise and fall in progesterone, lather, rinse, repeat. And this is kind of part of the experience, historically for most of human history. This is when you're a reproductive age woman, this is your life when you're not pregnant or breastfeeding. And so, given that, you're a proponent of supporting hormones and supporting hormone production, which I am too. Yeah. And given that so many women are put on birth control for issues like PCOS and endometriosis, in particular. I would be really interested in hearing about like what listeners can do. Let's say that we have somebody who's listening and she's got PCOS or she's got endometriosis. Like, what are some things that they might do differently that can help support their cycle without the birth control pill?
Yeah. Okay. Great question, and big question too.
Yeah. So and maybe we can maybe we can just start one at a time. We can start with like PCOS. So just like you can like quickly just describe what that is and what do you do?
Yeah. Okay. Let's just touch base. And of course, I mean, a lot of my writing is around all of this, like, because on the one, I can't be someone on the one hand who says actually there are problems with taking hormonal birth control and then not offer alternatives, right? So most of my work is about providing alternatives and like ways to not have symptoms. So PCOS is I would say at its core, I mean, it depends it's one of those things where almost anything in medicine. And I love that analogy of like, there's an elephant and all the blindfolded scientists and everyone's just like, oh, if they're feeling the tail, oh, that's a rope. Oh, that's a like this, that's a wall. That's a like,
yeah.
So depending on who's looking at PCOS, it's different things. I mean, it arguably is a whole body metabolic situation. But I guess primarily it's ovulatory disturbance. So it's just about how the calibration between the brain and the ovaries, how that's calibrated. Some of that would be ancestral. So some of that would be from just back to our evolutionary biology. This would be women are more likely to develop this situation if they come from a long lineage of kind of higher androgen survivors. So these would be, a lineage of women who, I mean, without getting too fanciful or getting all into the narrative, but like this is a tougher group. And I think it's great. I mean, I think they're great genes. They're not bad genes, but it does mean there can be this calibration to higher testosterone, relatively higher testosterone levels, which can be much too high in some cases in the modern environment. And probably from lots of things, from environmental toxins, like so many things in women's health. One of my messages too is it's not your fault. Like, I think, especially when we start talking about lifestyle and things we can do to help calibrate, and then there comes with this like almost built in, like, well, that because you've done something wrong is why you've ended up here. I would say that's not the case for almost any of the conditions I treat. I think there's a lot of evidence that when women get pushed into the higher androgen, not ovulating state of PCOS, some of it's from way beyond their control. It's from environmental toxin exposure in utero, which was nobody's fault, or it's from like epigenetics over the generations, or just to kind of really contextualize it. But yes, women can be in this, and it's confusing because as younger women, we're higher androgen, lower ovulation anyway. So there's the true PCOS state can look a lot like just the early teenage years when you're just getting your period and not ovulating yet. So higher androgens, higher insulin resistance potentially. So fortunately, PCOS responds really beautifully to a combination of natural treatments. One of the big heavy hitters is inositol. It's one of the supplements that helps promote healthy ovulation, improves insulin sensitivity, and it's a self-regulating system. So as soon as this is the contrast with. So the conventional approach is you're not ovulating, so let's shut down ovulation. Like to me, again, that's another jarring, counterintuitive. Like treat a condition of not ovulating with suppressing ovulation. I mean, and by the suppressing ovulation, they're also suppressing androgens, which is where the therapeutic comes in, which is valid. But you can also suppress androgens by regulating the system. So promoting ovulation. As soon as progesterone starts kicking in on its own, or you can also, in some cases, take natural progesterone to help this process. Progesterone both estradiol and progesterone have beneficial anti-androgen effects. So they help to mature the cycle, lower androgens, and you can sort of mature, and a lot of women can grow out of PCOS. This is the other thing too. So this is a whole other conversation on a future, next time we meet, but in the coming years, let's have a conversation about, I'm going to be doing a bit more content about this, about wear your diagnosis lightly, like the whatever the diagnosis is. This would be true, I would argue, in mental health, in women's health to a large extent. These diagnoses can be helpful because they can help point to what you need to do, but they can also, would you agree, like they can also be somewhat constraining. So I feel like if someone, my message to women out there, like if you've been given the diagnosis of PCOS in the past, fine. And maybe that was totally valid, but there can come a time where you maybe need to reevaluate that and think, is that still serving me, or is that still relevant? Because it can be outgrown. And also the thing about PCOS, and I try to always remember to mention this, any podcast I do, there's a lot of misdiagnosis going on. So one of the classic ways to not ovulate is to undereat, maybe not intentionally, but just overtraining, undereating, or stress, or just like especially in young women, the system's very sensitive to that. And so if that's your situation, so you're not ovulating regularly, irregular periods, maybe have a few pimples because you've just come off one of the hormonal medications that one of the types of hormonal birth control that can lead to post-pill acne. And then a doctor happens to do an ultrasound where they see polycystic ovaries, you're going to be slapped with the diagnosis of PCOS, which is possibly in your case not correct. So that's just a clinical thing. And the reason that's so important to mention is because often the narrative around PCOS, or the mainstream advice, is to eat less, I guess, to put it simply, or to modify diet or low carb or something, which there can be a place for that. And I've written extensively about how to manage that. But think of the scenario where a woman's lost her period to undereating and is then mistakenly told she has PCOS and decides to go low carb or eat less to correct it. So, I mean, I've had multiple conversations with patients where I say, you are unfortunately you're moving in the completely wrong direction from where you need to go to get your period back. So this is where the individual,
So there are things then that people can do, like to manage their PCOS. Yeah, and you do have and I'm going to put all of your books and your website in the show notes, because I know that there's so much information in those books about the things that.
I've got a new book coming on periods. So that's my new project. So hopefully by the end of this year, early next year, a mostly treatment manual for all these things. So so there are treatments for PCOS. I mean, and I'll just briefly, treatments for endometriosis is also having kind of a moment.
Yes.
I will just say to people, so endo is about endo. We're all that familiar with it. Poor endometriosis is about to undergo a major paradigm shift. There's the rumblings of seismic. So without going into, yes, obviously we're kind of at time here, so I won't go into all the details, but I would say the old paradigm of cut it out, so endometriosis is this condition where there's these lesions similar to uterine lining that grow in other places. And it can be quite a debilitating condition, but just zooming out, there's actually a lot going on with pelvic pain and endo when it's maybe not really endo. And there's just a lot going on. And I would point people to another one of my sort of favorite clinicians. I mean, she's a gynecologist in Australia. There's something going on with Australian gynecologists. They're just a radical group, some of them. And so she's got a book called Healing Pelvic Pain, where she tries to take a really fresh look at endometriosis. Her name's Dr. Peter Wright. So if people... Yeah, I mean, my new book has a big section on endo as well, but I would direct people to that and just say there is hope. So, I mean, categorically, hormonal birth control is not the only solution for it. And the thing I would say about endometriosis too, part of the paradigm shift, its old paradigm is that it's a progressive disease that has to be stopped. Mm-hmm. It's not. It can be. It can be in some cases, but in many cases, it's not progressive. It can go away on its own, even more severe cases. So on its own or with natural treatments. So, I mean, that's quite a paradigm shift in itself. Would you agree? That's because. Oh yeah.
No, totally. I mean, currently, I've heard so many different
yes,
poor approaches to endometriosis. I mean, there's the birth control is your only answer. I've heard that as, the answer that women have been given. I've had women, including one of my nieces, who's cut open to get diagnosed with endometriosis, but then they just put her back together again without doing anything about it. And then they're like, if you want to have this taken out, then you need to have another surgery, and then you have people who do superficial surgeries that aren't actually getting at the core of the issue. And then you're suggesting that might not even be necessary at all, and that it might be something else altogether.
Yeah. So this is endo of all the areas in women's health. And we've talked about some controversial ones today. Perimenopause, I'd say, has its own controversy going on. PCOS, but of all the women's health, endometriosis is the most, like, there's a lot going on there. I'll acknowledge that people are, it's very, yes. So there's, without being too vague, I think there's a lot of people, very smart people, are backing away from surgery. Not as a never do it. I mean, most people say there can be times when it's the best option, but it's like back to the drawing board with a lot of this. So I would just encourage people to just take a breath, take a beat. I know it's hard to take a beat or think again when you're in debilitating pain. And part of Dr. Peter Wright's work is just to acknowledge women's pain. Everyone should be on the same page that women should not be in terrible, excruciating pain. Nobody wants that. So, I mean, there are women should not have to put up with it. And there are lots of smart people like figuring out, and there are, I mean, and just anecdotally, even very debilitating severe cases of endo can respond incredibly well to seemingly quite simple things like diet changes and pelvic physiotherapy. Like there's a lot. It's a dynamic situation. One thing I just wanted to, just thinking about, this is segue now, but like off topic, but this quote, I had this great quote from a follower about perimenopause. I just want to speak a little bit in closing, I guess, to the current mode we're in 2026 on social media is a lot of biochemical speak. Like people feel like they have to, like they all know about like their cortisol curves and like even us, like we mentioned allopregnanolone and cytokines and insulin signaling. And so I heard this one of my followers said, who knew that going through perimenopause, I'd have to essentially become a biochemist to like understand all the, so I would just, as a takeaway, I would say you don't have to, whatever the health problem you're facing, you shouldn't have to become like totally versed in every biochemical or, anatomical nuance of the condition. There is a way through that, I don't know how to say this. I mean, the body does, it can come back to some basic principles. If you can give the body what it needs, it will a lot of the time surprise you and do, the segue for me was coming from the topic of endometriosis. So, I mean, of course, because the pain can be so terrible, people think, well, if the pain is that terrible, then obviously the treatment has to match that. Like the treatment has to be, do you know what I mean? Like, it somehow has to be
like equally as intense.
Yeah.
Yes.
Like people say, well, there's no way this pain's going to respond to simple things like diet and, pelvic physio. It's like, it can, like it does, because of the dynamic nature of biology and how and this has been a theme in a lot of my work, is like, give your body what it needs. And not absolutist. Sometimes stronger interventions are required, but you'll be surprised. But the body wants to be well. It doesn't want to be in pain or be not ovulating. It's and that's from 30 years of clinical practice. I can just tell you, like, bodies are responsive, especially and this is one thing I'll say, especially in younger women. So by the time I get into our 40s, things are a little harder and maybe require stronger interventions. But young women respond so well. Like, you just give their body half a chance to ovulate and it will. You just the simplest interventions for period. And so I'll just say, for period pain, a takeaway before we finish, consider zinc. It's been clinically trialed for period pain. It's a very simple intervention. Sometimes people can look at my writing about, avoiding normal types of cow dairy can dial down histamine and sort of pain pathways in some people. Again, not everyone. And also just work with the nervous system. This is your field, but I mean, the nervous system, especially the autonomic nervous system, affects everything. And this is where you have to get one of your guests. I'm going to try to share all your podcasts because I'm so interested, but if you could get a guest talking about the autonomic nervous system and the female autonomic nervous system in particular, I'd be very curious, because don't you think that again, I think the way this is our sympathetic, parasympathetic, the way it's calibrated or wired is probably the normal, but men's is a little different. So, I mean, the female autonomic nervous system is quite special, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, so I actually, I just did an episode with somebody talking about a vagus nerve stimulation.
Yeah.
And which there's been some really great work looking at that and endometriosis of all things.
Yes.
And what you can find is that even is supporting nervous system function.
Yes.
And and supporting the communication pathway between your brain and the periphery can improve symptoms in just about anything. And, and as I was saying to my guest, the way that I think about this is that when you are, because, everybody always thinks about when they think about the communication between the brain and the periphery with the vagus nerve, is they're thinking about the brain telling the body what to do. But most of the directionality in the relationship between the brain and the periphery and the vagus nerve is coming from the body up to the brain.
I know.
And so it is how our brain is learning about what's happening around it. So that way it can help regulate our systems. And the fact is, like, if we're stressed out, right, then we're in a sympathetic nervous system type of a response. And that is outward facing, where we're picking up on what's going on in the outward environment because it could potentially, create danger, and then figuring out what sorts of bodily changes need to happen to prepare for this thing that's going on the outside. Whereas when you are experiencing your parasympathetic response, your body is able to direct that information internally, right? And your brain is able to pick up on what's going on in the rest of the body and then make adjustments that way. And so, when you look at something like endometriosis, it's like, of course, you're going to support your body's ability to regulate the proliferation of endometrial tissue when your brain is given the opportunity to listen, right? To listen to the body. And then make adjustments, accordingly. And so I'm really excited about the research that's being done on the vagus nerve, because again, because the body is a big mess of spaghetti, as we talked about, because of the way our biology works. It's like one of these things that I think is going to have positive impacts on systems all over the place.
Agree. No, the autonomic nervous system is fascinating, and obviously we'll talk about that next time. But one thing about, just quickly, is it true that the female, so the autonomic nervous system calibrates and matures through our childhood and into our 20s before it kind of reaches it. It's never fully, it's a dynamic system, so it's never static. But my understanding through some of the research is the female, for women, there's sort of a slower maturation. And this is why, clinically, any clinician will know, you get these young women with low blood pressure, crashing blood sugar. Like, this is this sort of autonomic instability that you can get into a woman's, into her sort of early 20s. Whereas for men, for boys, that tends to kind of stabilize a bit earlier. Is that something that you've come across in your research? Or
No, I've not come across that. That's really fascinating. And it's also fascinating when you consider, because when you look at research, and this isn't looking at autonomic stability specifically, but even just like looking at the brain structurally and functionally, you get changes with pregnancy and postpartum and all these other things, where I feel like the human form, like the female form, is just a dynamic system. It's in some ways it's more of a dynamic process, I think, than the male body, just because there is all of this constant remodeling, and so it wouldn't surprise me to learn that there is sex differentiation in that.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, it's been so great. It's been very fun.
I'm sorry to have kept you long.
No.
We did not even get to some of the things I was hoping to talk about.
Well. Metabolism, and we'll have to save that for another day.
We'll do a part 2. So I'm gonna ask like a wrap up question, and we'll cut all this little stuff out where I cried about how sad I am I didn't get to ask all my questions. So Lara, as somebody who's been really, you've been so instrumental in so much of the work and the awareness out in the world about increasing women's awareness of hormones and cycles and women's reproductive health. And what are you most excited about moving forward? What are you excited about in the world of women's health and hormones?
Yeah, well, for me currently in 2026, and it's to do with, I just poured all my heart into this new book about periods. I've really moved back to young women. Obviously I have a book on perimenopause. I feel like the perimenopause discussion has dominated so much. And I saw some quote, someone said on social media, it's like, okay, you need to start thinking about perimenopause at 25. I'm like, no, you don't. You do not. You don't. You need to start thinking, you need to think about ovulation and so I'm pretty passionate about, and not just women in their 20s, but teenagers. I think this is where, through the biology lens, if you can get the biological system early, relatively early on, you can really change the trajectory of how it all goes. So I've got a workshop coming up for teenagers. I'm going to be in London actually doing, you're not in London in June by any chance, are you?
No, but maybe I will be.
Okay. I'm going to be doing a workshop
like I need to.
Teenage girls. And yeah, so it's,
gosh.
That's where my passion is. And again, this is, even though I don't have any of my own female descendants, I think I'll just, in closing, I'll say, like, and I'd be curious for your listeners if they share this, maybe not especially, but even for those of us who haven't had biological children, there is, after I'm in my late 50s now, like there is this thing kicks in of like, maybe not for everyone, but anyway, for me, I'm definitely feeling this, like, I want to say matronly, but like, I really want young women to be okay. Like, I'm just like really, I mean, I care also about perimenopausal women, but like, I just feel like they've got, you've got this, like they've got a lot going on, but like, let's look at the teenagers and the women in their 20s. And anyway, this is where I'm feeling most passionate, and hopefully I can make a difference there.
I love that. I think that's wonderful. Well, I think that you've played, even though you don't have direct offspring of your own, I think that you've played a really important role in raising generations of women now with the teaching that you've given them on their, increasing their body literacy and learning about their hormones and learning about their cycles. And no, I think that we all owe you a debt of gratitude. So
that's very
thank
sweet.
you. No, and I mean it. I mean, this is something that, as you noted, people weren't talking about for a very long time. And you are a big part of where the public awareness of all of these issues has come from. So thank you, Dr. Briden.
Yeah. Thank you, Sarah.
And that's it for today's episode of the XX Lab. If you want more, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're enjoying the show, a rating or review helps other people find it. See you next episode.